Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here talking about this wonderful book, which I read when it came out in hardcover, and I'm very happy to be able to revisit with Richard in paperback. So what we're going to do this evening is we're going to talk for about 35 minutes, and then we're going to open up the floor to comments and questions. And I got a new printer, which I don't know how to work, so I'm reading my notes off of a file on my iPhone. I just don't want you to think I'm checking the news, God forbid, or the stock quotes, even less. I have, before I get going, I just want to shill a little bit for this book. Apart from communicating the essential theme about the heroism and uncommon courage of a few individuals who were able to stand up against the tide of tyranny during the Second World War, and provoking us to think about what is the nature of the personality of a person who takes extraordinary personal risks and faces real danger, in a time when everyone else is not doing that. And so that's I think the central fascination of the book is learning so much about these people. But I have to tell you that it's absolutely engrossing. So Richard tells the stories of these 10 people, but each chapter is like a mini social history, a biography. You get incredible amounts of detailed background about the milieu from which these people emerged, the places where they lived, their family life. And, when I was reading it, I was just enjoying it so much as narrative, they're just wonderfully told. But since the question is, what makes a person who is able to do these heroic things, I think it's not just window dressing, it's essential information about what makes a person the kind of person who stands up. So I just highly recommend it. As you heard, I wrote a very different kind of book which touches on the Holocaust, about trying to find out what happened to my relatives who were not saved. And although we learned that there was two middle-aged ladies, two Polish school teachers, who were hiding, my uncle and aunt and one of their daughters, and someone betrayed them, and they were all killed. And I wish I knew more about these two ladies, because I would like to have them be honored, because, I always tell people, the people who tried to rescue people but weren't successful were as heroic as everyone else. I think that's always something worth remembering. I'm going to proceed a little counterintuitively, which is sort of tackle the big questions first and then go to some specifics, because I really want you to hear from Richard some of the individual, tales. You start the book by saying the Holocaust always seems something distant to me. And so the obvious question to start with for me, because I had a personal connection, right, is what drew you to the subject? How did you get involved? You talk a little bit about it in the introduction, but so much because the Holocaust has a kind of lurid fascination for a lot of people because of the scale of the horror and the means of the cruelty and destruction. Not many people focus on the rare bright spots. So I just thought you might tell people a little bit about how you got into this.
Sure. Oh, thank you. I wanted to thank everyone for coming, and to the Y for having us here. And I also want to thank very much appreciative of the Susan Mendes Foundation and the JNF and Echoes and Reflections for all of their support. And Daniel, I do want to thank you for doing this. I'm a huge fan of your work, and I was thinking about we share also an interest in the classics, and I think both An Odyssey and The Lost you're the only person I know who's actually sort of invented a new genre, which is sort of this mix of memoir and literary criticism. And so if anyone has not read both of Daniel's books, The Lost is an incredible classic of Holocaust literature, and I think An Odyssey is probably one of the best books I've ever read about losing a parent, as well as the Odyssey. So it's really one. I'm really very honored to be in conversation. As I mentioned at the start of the book, I first got interested in rescue when I was in college, when the Holocaust Museum opened in Washington. And nobody in my, I guess we're fortunate that my family's been on both sides of my family in the United States for a long time. So we didn't have any direct relatives that perished. But we went down, like a lot of American Jews did, to Washington. And I remember going through the exhibit, and it is extraordinarily enervating and difficult. And as I've talked about the book over the last couple of years with a lot of different audiences, Jewish and not Jewish, everyone seems to have that experience. They all talk about the pile of shoes that are there, and then if you look closely, you see children-sized shoes, and 1.5 million out of the 6 million were children. And for me, I was quite sensitive, and it was very, very, very upsetting. And at the end of the exhibit, which is still there, is a small exhibit to talk about rescue. And actually, my understanding is they're redoing the Holocaust Museum, and they're going to actually make this much more front and center. And I was drawn to this picture, which is now on the front of the book, of this guy with a young man with a pipe who was about the same age as me at the time. And his name was Alexander Schmorell, and he was part of a group called the White Rose. I don't know if anybody's heard of that, but they're quite well known in Germany, and they were a bunch of mostly medical students. There was the guy who ran it was a guy named Hans Scholl, and his younger sister who was in college, Sophie Scholl. They were basically very idealistic students who tried to foment a student uprising against Hitler, and they did this by circulating leaflets. And actually, the second leaflet, which was written by that guy with the pipe, was actually one of the first documents that was publicizing the Holocaust. He said at this time, 300,000 Jews had been killed in the most bestial way. And it was sort of the kind of document that you would want to read, that it was very erudite. It quoted Lao Tzu and Thucydides, and they circulated them around, and it actually became quite a sort of a bête noire for the Nazis, and no one knew who they were. They signed it under this anonymous name, the White Rose. And then one day, and they got as far as Vienna. They were circulating all over Germany, and then one day, the brother and the sister were leaving leaflets during University of Munich during class, and the bell rang, and Sophie Scholl took a number of them out of her purse and threw them down an atrium. And there was a maintenance man who was an ardent Nazi who locked the door, and they were summarily arrested. And within days, they were put on trial. Hitler sent his personal judge down, and they were executed. And it was so I at the time, this was very powerful to me, that there was somebody who tried to do something, right? And I felt like a personal connection to them because they were kind of like around my age, and I was going to write my thesis on it, and then I realized I didn't know German, so that didn't work. But on the 75th anniversary of their execution, I wrote an article about them for the New York Times on the op-ed page, but it was basically a memory piece, like we should remember these kids, and it went absolutely viral. It trended to the top 10 articles of the day, and it was shared widely all over the internet and Twitter, which is a very dark place. Okay, and there was such a positive reaction, and at the time it was right after the Parkland shooting, and there were a lot of people who were drawing connection to those kids. And so I started writing up these stories of rescue. I did, I think, 7. And I had the same reaction every time. In fact, I did one on the King of Morocco that went to #2 on Reddit. It was only beaten by a girl taking a cardboard cutout of Danny DeVito to the prom. So this was like big audience. And so I decided to turn them into this book. And sorry, Danny, for like a long-winded answer to your question. But you're right, so when I've seen all of the reaction, I've never had one person online ever do any kind of Nazi meme, which is remarkable. one exception. When the hardcover came out and the head of the ADL tweeted it, he got automatic bots. But other than that, literally, so I think there is something that these people inspire that is really good for the world. There's all kinds of reasons we can talk about why historically it has not been the focus for people with the Holocaust. But to me, I think the other thing is like the reaction that I had, which is the reaction a lot of people have, and particularly children, which is you look at the magnitude of the Holocaust and what happened. People shut down.
Yeah.
And so I have a friend who made a film about Le Chambon, which is a chapter in my book, and he uses an analogy. He says, the stories of rescue are almost like a banister that you can hold on to, and then you kind of can understand the enormity of what happened. But if we want to build a better place, I think it's important to study what went right. Why did these, and they're very rare, right? I mean, if you actually think about it, there are 27,000 people who've been honored by Yad Vashem. And as you point out, yes, there were many people who died rescuing. They should be counted too. But even if you add a zero, it's vanishingly small. 27,000 out of 500 million people. So if you filled up Madison Square Garden with a representative sample, you'd have one rescuer. But to me, these people, I think there's a historical injustice that everyone knows who Himmler is and who Goering is, and no one knows who, not no one, but very few people know, for example, who Aristides de Sousa Mendes was, who saved 10,000 people in 3 weeks.
Right. But I mean, it is an interesting, so you raised the issue of numbers, right? So when I was working on my book, a number of the survivors that I talked to would always said the same thing. They said, well, if you took a random sample of 10 people, because of course anyone I interviewed who was a survivor was saved by someone, right? Sometimes because they were good people, sometimes for money, whatever, there were all different reasons that people did this. And they said, well, if you took 10 people, 2 might be very good, and 2 might be real devils. And most people in a time of crisis or danger will just neither look to the right nor the left and just somehow hope that everything will be okay, but don't want to get involved, right? But when I read your introduction, and you say it was 27,000, blah blah blah, which is less than, so my numbers are wrong, right? Or my people were more optimistic, right? So it raises the question. These people who did these things are operating in the face of unbelievable danger. So you must at some point in the process of writing this book, where the 10 people whose stories you decided to tell, and there's a very interesting part at the beginning of Richard's introduction where he describes why he chose these people. There's some people are very well known, you don't need to write about them, blah blah blah. And did you ever get to a point where you made a conclusion? Like, what did these people have in common? Some were religious, some were more intellectual. Is there a common denominator? What makes a person risk not only their lives, but their families' lives?
Yes.
In order to do the right thing.
So I do have some theories on that. It is interesting, because there are obviously some places like Denmark or Le Chambon or Albania where it was different. It was actually more like 8 or 9 out of 10 people, or even all of but those were rare. So there was, unfortunately, again, because rescue's been so overlooked for a variety of reasons, and because people are interested, after the war, everyone was interested in why did people go along, because that was what most people did. Why did they collaborate? You had the Milgram experiment. There was one study that was done systematically of rescuers, and what they found was that, and this is not going to be satisfying, they were Freudian doctors, and they said that how you were disciplined as a child was the only thing they could find to correlate. And yes, and they defined this term, the altruistic personality. What's interesting is they found that almost all rescuers were treated very nicely as children by their parents. They were loved, their interests were valued, and so there's a few things that later in life that I think would, as you point out, people who were religious, if you weren't into the hierarchy, but if you were into kind of the real teachings of the religion. people who are in international professions tended to be more rescuers. People in creative professions tended to be more. But the one thing that I really saw in common was this thing about early childhood. And I think everybody in my book, and I'm trying to think if there are any rescuers that I've come across, because I've gone through hundreds of stories who didn't have this, but almost everyone, let's say, had a parent, usually could be both parents, at least one parent, or it could be a major figure in your early childhood who did a couple of things. They would tell them, which is the thing that's expected, right, is that they grew up in an environment where they said, we don't treat people badly because they're different. In fact, Irena Sendler, who was a social worker who saved 2,500 Jewish, basically babies and toddlers and children going in and out of the Warsaw Ghetto several times a week, which is incredible. Her father was a doctor who had died treating poor Jews and he died of cholera or typhus that he caught from them. And he told her when he was dying, he actually said, and she always talked about this, he said, if you see someone drowning, you must save them. The other thing I think which is really important that they did is when you grow up in an environment where you're valued as a child, this is a little bit, I think, counter to, but this leads to high self-esteem. And if you think about what a rescuer had to do, which if Daniel's, the survivors are correct, and even if it's 2 out of 10 people, most people around you are doing something very different. Mm-hmm. And so you have to have a lot of self-confidence to believe not only that your moral compass is right, but also that if you act, you can actually make a difference. Because otherwise, what is the point? Mm. So I think a lot of it comes back to early childhood. And I think also a lot of it so when you even look at the societies, which is why I think the anti-bullying campaign is actually quite important, because when you create a society where the majority of people actually stand up for what's right or to protect people who are persecuted, then as I think there's lots of examples actually of discrete communities where 95 to 100% of the Jews were actually saved. And again, that all goes to what kind of culture do you have?
Right. I think that's fascinating because I often, in my researches, would always wondered, and I mean, just to give you a sense of what people, so my relatives were in Eastern Poland, and I was interviewing, when I went back to this town in order to research my book, and I was interviewing a Ukrainian woman, and she said, at the beginning, a lot of people were wanting to help the Jews because, they were our neighbors, we knew them, we socialized. And I said, what changed? And she said, well, there was one time there was a roundup, and in the confusion of the roundup, a local guy whose name was Medved, a Ukrainian, took a little Jewish girl and hustled her into his house, and they took care of her, and then someone ratted out on them. And he said, not only did they hang the whole family in the village square, including babies, but everyone in the county whose name was Medved was executed. And she said, after that, no one tried to help. So I think it's very important when we're talking about rescuers to have some sense of what, these people and everyone knew that this kind of fate was awaiting them. So I think one has to have a very vivid sense.
No, absolutely. I think it's very important not to judge people because, and obviously, the further east you went, that was what you described as very true in Poland, right? Yeah. And so some of the rescuers I talk about were more in Western Europe where the stakes were high, but it was more like, in Holland you'd be arrested. Whereas when you went further east into Poland in part, they executed the entire family. I have never heard of the whole phone book, which is crazy, but there was recently a family that was just sanctified by the Catholic Church where they tried to rescue and all of them were executed, including children.
Yeah. So I mean, everyone knew that, and I think it's very important to always have that in mind. I remember once I was doing a lecture when my book came out, and a nice lady in the audience stood up and said, I'm sure if you were hiding Jews in the basement and they came to your house, and they held a gun to your head, you would do the right thing. And I said, the problem is they'd be holding a gun to your children's head, right? You always have to remember the moral complexities. So I like what you said about not judging, because I'm not sure how how I would act in that. I might be willing to give up my own life, maybe, but they didn't make it so easy.
I mean, some of the rescuers were, it's interesting because one of the more interesting parts of the research process was I did have the opportunity to talk to a number of the children of rescuers, and it was kind of a mixed bag, which was like, just when you were talking about sort of the extremes, like some of these people were in normal times would be considered quite eccentric, or even a little crazy, and so like, Hiram Bingham, who was a diplomat, I interviewed 3 of his children. They revere him. He was a very good parent, and they review him as sort of like almost like a saint. Varian Fry, who he worked with, together they saved a lot of the intelligentsia of Europe. His son does not like him. He told me he was violent with him. He was manic. He probably was on some sort of like manic high during this, which allowed him to do it.
Yeah.
And some of them had illegitimate children. Like I actually found a lot of comfort in that because someone like Irena Sendler was a social worker, but most of these people were not. They didn't set out to save the world, right? They found themselves in very, very difficult circumstances. They're like the Shakespeare, some have greatness, some achieve greatness, some are born great, and some have greatness thrust upon it. They're the latter category. And so, like, what I found interesting was you don't have to be a saint to be a hero, right? Like these people were very flawed. They were even the Le Chambon, which is this town where there was a pastor and his wife. They were major figures in the nonviolent movement. And I interviewed their daughter, who was she's 95 years old, and she was an amazing recall. She told me that I sent her the chapter ahead of time, and she was like, no, the carpet was a different color than, and she remembered everything. And then I said, well, how were your parents? She said, oh, they were wonderful. They were like these, they were like really well-known, sort of like secular saints. And then she said, but I said, well, how were they as parents? She said, oh, they were great, but they were very busy. Like, they never wouldn't have come to our piano recital. And I thought about that, like she's 95 and she still remembers that, right? And she obviously admired her parents, but like these people are complicated, right? And they were really under a lot of pressure too. So, but I always found that I did not find people were the kind of sort of self-congratulatory or like sort of or even just professional people that went out, which are great too, but to rescue. These are people who really just the war was thrust upon them and they did the right thing.
Right. So you mentioned Le Chambon, which is the remote French village where this extraordinary rescue of many people took place. And you also have a chapter about the Danish rescue, which is a famous chapter. And I think I would be very interested to hear what you had to say because, so your chapters are essentially about individuals or, members of, like the Trochmés, these French people who, you must know my cousin's book, Le Plateau, Maggie Paxson's book, was this very interesting case study. And, sometimes you can explain, right? They were Huguenots, they were French Protestants, so they themselves knew what it was like to be persecuted. There are some kind of factors that allow you to grasp why this was done on a mass scale. But I find it very interesting that there are a couple of examples of mass rescue, where a whole community becomes involved or a large group. So a lot of your focus, and I want to get to those people in a minute, are about these very interesting individuals. Susa Mendez, the late Queen of England's mother-in-law, who was a saintly figure, who rescued Jews in Greece. But what's the sociology when a whole country, virtually, like Denmark, will make a concern, I say a whole country, but you know what I mean, where a mass of people gets involved. Do you have any?
Well, it was really the whole country, I have to say,
it's
because
an amazing story.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, before, part of the reason I wrote the book is most of these stories are really unknown. The 2.5 or 3 that people really know are obviously Schindler because of the movie, Wallenberg, and then Denmark. A lot of people know, but if you don't know the story, basically the entire country, virtually from the king down, they were tipped off by actually a German member of the Nazi Party who was not an anti-Semite and was very close to the Danes. He tipped off the Danes, who then turned around and basically staged this almost like Dunkirk-type flotilla where they took basically the entire Jewish population across the river, the Straits, to Sweden and to safety. And then about the 7,200, 500 were rounded up and they were taken to Theresienstadt, and every week the Danish government called to check on them. They sent them food, they sent them medicine, and they, all but 50 who died of disease, survived the war. So a 99% survival rate. Le Chambon, 5,000 people saved, kind of in plain sight, 3,500 children. Right down the street was Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. Camus was so inspired by this, he was literally there, and part of the plague was inspired by what he saw. Albania, nothing in common with Denmark. The only majority Muslim country in Europe. All three religions lived in harmony, the Jews and the Christians, back to the Roman times. FDR's ambassador, when he went there, said, this is the only country I've ever seen where there's no religious bigotry. The only country with more Jews at the end of the war than before. So I've thought a lot, like, why did this happen? And I think there's a few things. Some of it is like luck of geography, et cetera. But you look at Denmark, and this is true of all these places. So like they had a really ingrained culture against religious bigotry. It had been banned like 200 years earlier. The Jews had been there for a long time. They were called the Viking Jews, a lot of them. Many of them had fled the Inquisition. And the Danes, and this is, they believed that their Jewish neighbors were Danes first and Jews second. A lot of them had fought for Denmark. And so from the day that the Nazis came, they said you cannot persecute the Jews. Now, Albania is a little different because they had a culture of hospitality, which is actually quite similar to like a Homeric culture. Like they'd rather somebody die, they die than somebody who was a guest in their home be taken. But what I found was very interesting is you look at Denmark. It was supposed to be what the Nazis called a model protectorate because it was Aryan, but they realized right away, the Germans, the occupation, and by the way, Denmark during the Nazis kept their government in place, and during the occupation, the fascist party in Denmark received between 1% and 2% of the vote, okay, which was like while the Germans were there. So they knew that how strongly the Danes felt about the Jews, and so the Wehrmacht, the Navy, and even the SS did not want to round up the Jews because they knew if they did it, it would cause a huge problem. And so it actually went up to Hitler himself had to order the roundup of the Danish Jews, and exactly what happened was, it was one of the triggers that then led to like an uprising of the Danes. And what it shows you is that even if everyone stands together, you can even stand up to the Nazis. And I think the Le Chambon is a very interesting example because even though it was an area of resistance, the pastor and his wife and a lot of the other pastors, because it was a network, were believers in nonviolence. And during the war, they implemented that. It didn't mean they weren't afraid. They were not willing to risk their lives, but they were nonviolent people, and they were very successful at rescue, even with some of the worst Nazis right nearby. And it shows you that and there was almost, so in Denmark I know of one instance that I came across of betrayal, none in Le Chambon, none in Albania. I mean, Bulgaria saved its Jews. Finland was quite heroic, but so it's something. It was whether it was because of the distaste for bigotry. It was a mix of things, right? And so, but if everyone kind of felt that way and you were able to stand together, it's very different than being out on your own. I mean, it is interesting. Like going back to what you're saying about the stakes, right? There was a guy in Holland who was interviewed that I found this very interesting. Holland was better than other places. It was a mixed record, right? But it was better than some other places. And one of the rescuers said, we can't expect everybody to do what we did, but we're the tip of the spear was the metaphor he used. But he said what was different in Holland than a place like Poland was that people sympathized with what we were doing. So even if they weren't willing to risk their life, they would look the other way. Right, so if you were seeing a rescue in a place like Holland, people would look the other way. In Poland, they would run to turn you in. Yeah. Right, and because you got money or whatever, or out of spite. So how a community acts was actually made a huge difference in what people's outcomes were.
Yeah, there's a wonderful museum in Copenhagen of devoted to the rescue, designed by Daniel Mendelsohn, and the wooden floors undulate to give you the sense of the sea, because they ferried them all over to Sweden. And the thing that made me burst into tears was that every Jew who came back
Yes.
got a telegram from the king personally welcoming them back to Denmark, and I just became unhinged. I was so moved because, the counterexample, and I think this is, a large part of the takeaway of your book, is every counterexample to the indifference, let alone the outright inhumanity that was the rule everywhere else, gives the lie to the supposition that nothing could be done.
No, absolutely.
That's why I think your what you said at the beginning, that we need to look at this event from the other end of the telescope. We should be focusing on these people instead of being fascinated by the aberrant psychology of Himmler or whoever. That it shows that you could have stood up where most people didn't. And I hate to bring the specter of current events into the discussion, but I've been, I think, as you have probably too, already in this country there's a chill in the air. I was having dinner with a bunch of lawyers the other night, and the president is going after this law firm that participated in the January 6th prosecutions, and doing these terrible punitive things against the firm, but also against clients of the firm.
Yeah.
And these lawyers were, everyone was decrying this, but they also simultaneously said, we're not going to do business with them. And so the mechanics of how intimidation work are already being played out in front of our eyes. I don't think it's a stretch to say that at this point. So I wonder if you've also been worrying and thinking about the fact that in this country, unimaginably, we're now in a situation where, we already know what people are afraid, right? And in atmospheres of fear. So I was just wondering if you were thinking about that lately.
Of course, yes. And when the book came out, I would always be asked, do you think the Holocaust could happen again? And then I used to say, well, I think the world's evolved past that, but obviously there are 40 genocides since World War II, so it still happens elsewhere, and there's a lot we can do to prevent that. And then after October 7th, I started thinking about the Holocaust and the fact that I think the Iranians would drop a bomb and kill 6 million Jews if they could. Mm-hmm. So that alarmed me. And now here, the sort of breakdown of the norms, and yes, it's very alarming, I have to say. Do I think we're going to another Holocaust? No, but a lot of the sort of early stages of fascism, in terms of, there's like a meanness also to what's going on. But I will say that when you look at the Holocaust, it didn't happen, and fascism doesn't happen in one day. And people look back and they say, okay, like when was the tipping point, right? And one of the things was the early boycott of Jewish businesses. When you talk about like standing up, right? The Nazis would always test, right? Like after the Evian conference, when nobody would take the Jews in, they started to say, well, maybe we could kill them. Before that, they were just trying to expel the Jews. They had an plan to send them to Madagascar. Early on, one of the first things they did was a Jewish boycott. And a lot of people, if you went past the boycott, they put a thug in the door. Nothing really happened, but most people abided by the boycott because they were afraid. And then that emboldens people.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what my question wasn't, was there going to be another Holocaust?
Yeah, no, I understand.
I mean, I get where, the question people of our generation grew up asking was, how could this happen, right? And what I'm fascinated by the current situation is you see exactly how it
Yes, absolutely.
People are afraid. They want to do what's good for their business. They don't want to get, blah, blah, blah. So I've been thinking a lot about that. I want, because I know the audience has questions and this hour is going very fast, but I think I would like you to talk about the sort of aftermath for some of these individual rescuers, because we have the sense quite often that they were heroized and celebrated, and that's one of the things one gets from your book is that, for example, Sousa Mendes, some people were, not at all celebrated by their own governments. And I was just wondering if you wanted to say a little.
Yeah, I would say it's actually the reverse.
Yeah.
Most of them suffered a great deal. And there's something very upsetting. And in fact, I think the Sousa Mendes story, which, it was a Portuguese diplomat who gave visas to many, many people and then was basically punished by his government, which was not unusual. So the same thing happened to the Japanese diplomat Sugihara. It happened to Varian Fry, and Hiram Bingham was bounced out of the service, the State Department, by the United States. Many of these people, Oskar Schindler was like shunned after the war, that he had rocks thrown at him. Wallenberg was disappeared into a Soviet prison and died. Most of the rescuers actually were, really had very difficult times afterwards. And I've thought a lot about why that is. And I think, part of it, so for some people, I think the diplomats were a certain category because, many rescuers, when you go through like an exhibit, will often be diplomats. But that's because they had the ability to help a lot of people with visas. But the number of diplomats who actually did that was very small, because a lot of people go into the foreign service, same way they go into the church, they like hierarchy. So, disobeying orders, that was more important. Like Sousa Mendes, or take Fry. I mean, he and Bingham were in trouble because we thought, a lot of people in the State Department were very anti-Semitic. They also thought the Germans were going to win the war. Salazar was a very important sort of figure, and Franco. And so they thought they were making us look bad to Vichy and to the Germans, the Nazis. So that was the US policy at the time. But I think also the war did not end anti-Semitism. So I think a lot of these people, when people found out what they did, to your point about how dangerous it was, they said, well, first of all, why would you help the Jews? Who likes the Jews? You could have brought a lot of, you could have gotten us all killed. How could you have done that? But I think ultimately it goes to some of the other things you were saying, which is that it's very hard to say that you couldn't have done anything when someone next door to you did. And I think there was a lot of resentment.
Yeah.
They're inconvenient.
I think it was shame.
Yeah.
That's what I took away from the book.
Yes.
That they shamed the government, because every other government, or the government was saying there's nothing we can do.
Yep.
And as we know, most governments did nothing, including this government,
Yep.
right? So I think those figures were a thorn in their side, morally. That's why they couldn't tolerate them, because I think a lot of people who aren't familiar with some of these stories, you get to the last few pages and the war is over and you think they're going to be, and the only people who recognized them were Yad Vashem, sometimes, years after the fact. There's so much more I want to say, but I think we should go to questions and comments from the floor, because it's 8:15 already. Yes, sir.
Richard, as you know from our exchange, I am a co-founder of the Illinois Holocaust Museum and also a second-generation Sugihara survivor. Daniel asked the question I would have asked, but knits all these people together, so I'll focus on something a little different. In interviewing the Sugihara family and many others, they were all hardwired for decency, and they had this view, uplifting but misguided, that anyone in my situation would do the same thing. So comment on that, because I found it to be true, but they were all, as you say, thrust into a situation where they could act or they could not.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because it's one thing I've noticed is that the language used by almost every rescuer is exactly what you just said. Yeah. It's identical. They did not actually one of the reasons I think a lot of their stories didn't come out for a while is they were so modest. But I think it was not false modesty. They literally did not think that they did anything special. Or there was, Gino Bartoli, was a very famous cyclist, said, well, it takes away when you talk about it. But it is literally those words that they use. So again, you have to put yourself in the position of a rescuer, where this is the type of personality who really just thinks that they just did what anybody else would do. I met so I'd never met a rescuer from the Holocaust because of the age, but I did meet the guy from Hotel Rwanda, Paul Rusesabagina, and I spent like 2 hours with him, and it was like literally talking to like Sugihara or any of these people. It was exactly the profile, and he also was telling me a lot of it was just sort of this ad hoc, kind of like response to stuff of just, this is what's going on, and I have to do this. Someone is in jeopardy. So yeah, it doesn't. I mean, there's some people who are like that, but obviously what they did was extraordinary. Yeah. And the fact that they don't think it's extraordinary, it's sort of like a virtuous circle. I am curious, by the way. Like I know there are a number of people through either Sugihara or like how many people in this room are like descended from somebody who was rescued by like either Sousa Mendes, Sugihara, or another rescuer? So it's really interesting because one of the things that I found when I started writing these stories is people would email me. I would obviously get emails from people who say my family was rescued, but I would inevitably find that somebody I knew that I had no idea was rescued was alive because of them. And I think that goes to the whole, kind of on the back of the medal, it says, he who saves one life saves, like, there are probably, there's hundreds of thousands, if not more, people who are alive today because of these 10 stories. And when you think about the context of the Jewish people, it's a huge portion. It's like it's like everybody who, it makes up the amount that was rebuilt since the Holocaust, yeah.
I heard the same thing from a rescuer. They always say the same thing. How could I have?
No, it's uncanny, actually. It's the same words.
But it goes to your point about the psychology. Yes.
I'm Greg. I have a question that might be a little provocative, but I really want to know your point of view on that. So you said that because in Denmark and Albania there was a lack of religious bigotry, right? So if we would put post-Holocaust today to Europe, do you think the countries who saved the Jews would be still the same? Or because of the current climate, and this is where I get a little bit non-PC, where we have, a flow of illegal immigrants in Europe who are really the root cause of current contemporary anti-Semitism. So do you think that the same countries would be so vehemently helping the Jews there, or would the map change today?
It's a very good question. Virag, by the way, spends her life defending, fighting against anti-Semitism as someone who's not Jewish. So she has an interesting perspective on this. I don't know, actually, because I think the rise in anti-Semitism is very alarming, and some of the countries, that were, like in Scandinavia, the culture it's changed now. So I don't know. A place like Albania, probably because it was so ingrained in this hospitality tradition. Some place like Le Chambon, which has to this day, they have Ukrainian and Afghan and other refugees there. They don't think about it that way. But yes, the rise of anti-Semitism there has sort of scrambled the chessboard, I think. But again, it was few and far between anyway to begin with. Most of this was, individuals. I'm very interested, and a lot of people are interested in groups, but I don't think it's unusual for an entire community or entire country to. So most of the people in my book are actually individuals fighting against everything around them. And I think the rise in anti-Semitism tells you that a lot of places, not just in Europe, this could happen. And there would be few people, but they would be there. I will say one thing. I have been waiting for the stories to come out after October 7th. And there's this thing out there saying, it didn't happen. I think it's too early to say that because there were definitely Druze and Bedouins who they've already honored for doing that. So, yeah.
Ma'am?
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Daniel, for your books. During COVID, I listened to The Lost, and it was good company.
Thank you.
And thank you. I've always been interested in the rescuer. I've taught Holocaust and Jewish resistance. I was a Vlachka teacher from 1996. But the subjects that always interest me were the survivors and the rescuers. I had the pleasure of meeting Nicholas Winton. And I told him that I taught. And he said to me, He meant the children to
Yeah.
be rescued.
That he rescued.
So I thank you for this because it's something that is very important to me. When I teach and we would kind of focus in on the righteous, it became imbalanced. They thought that there were live righteous people and they weren't.
Right.
So as a teacher, teaching to a community, I think it's a very important piece, but it has to be in balance with what else is being taught. But I thank you both very much from the bottom of my heart.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. In the,
Yeah, I think most Jews today, especially young ones, Jason, right?
Yeah.
I think most Jews today, especially young ones, aren't afraid of Trump per se. Like you were saying, it's Islamic extremists, Muslim extremists on college campuses, etc. There's a lot more of them than they are of us, billions more. So I'm curious, social media in general, how do we stand up for ourselves? There's been a lot of really smart people, Zach Sage Fox, people like that, who are young college kid influencer type people and standing up for themselves. How do you suggest we stand up for ourselves as Jews when we're outnumbered? Yeah, I guess that's
I'll
let you
yeah, I'll try. Yeah, no, we are outnumbered and we always will be outnumbered, but we've also survived for a long period of time. One of the concerns I had actually before, in Israel at the moment is, we spent 2,000 years in exile because of internal fighting. I will say that there is, you are correct, that there's, in the United States at the moment, a lot of the very scary anti-Semitism that you're seeing is coming from the left, but I would be wary of, thinking that on the right, that the anti-Semitism there is just is less dangerous. And the thing I would say also, but it's important we keep in mind that both extremes, anti-Semitism was a very big part of it. So one thing we didn't talk about was actually rescuers in the eastern part of Europe. Many of their stories didn't come out and just talking about how people suffered because they were behind the Iron Curtain. And so there was institutional anti-Semitism as well. And in fact, there was a number of heartbreaking moments in my book where people made the wrong decision because they were so afraid of the Russians that they stayed when the Germans came.
Yeah.
And because the history there, right, was anti-Semitism, what you saw was the, what they call, I guess now, the horseshoe effect, right, where both the extreme left and the extreme right. So I would say that, Jews should stick up for themselves. We should talk about the fact that, there's been huge contribution to humanity across many, 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 many different fields from a very, very small minority, but also the tenets of liberal democracy and all of the, I think, a lot of the Western civilization, these human rights is very important because when the system starts breaking down, like Daniel was talking about, and you start having extremism on either side, that's where the first people they go after are the Jews, because we're a minority to everybody, and we're a minority that's also very easy to go after because there can be a resentment as well, and then it leads. So, but I'm very worried about this. There's never been a place where the system breaks down, like the liberal democratic system, and you don't have a problem. So I would be very wary of either side that's trying to take that down.
Right. I would add to that, because I think as Jews, we're fighting, as Jewish Americans, we're fighting a war on two fronts, right? So there's the age-old specter of anti-Semitism, which always, as you point out, Richard, raises its head during these kinds of political situations. Just simply as American citizens, we're also, very concerned. But I would think, as far as, how to stand up for ourselves as Jews, keep calling a spade a spade. When things happen, identify them, call out language. I keep thinking of Musk and his increasing Jew baiting, and it's like, was it a Nazi salute? Was it not a Nazi? That kind of thing. I think it's very important to keep calling out. And when you see these kinds of incidents, to flag them, to make people aware from them. When people are using coded language, whatever, I think that's super important right now. because they hide. They toss these grenades and then say, "Oh no, that's not what I meant," and it's exactly the kind of thing we know about, from history. And I think what the other thing is very important is to guard against. I keep thinking right now. I wonder if you agree. I keep wondering. This is probably what German Jews felt like in 1932. It's like, but we're German.
Yeah.
We live in a liberal democracy. It can't be that bad. I think we have to. There's a kind of American exceptionalism historically. We keep thinking we're the good guys in history. All evidence to the contrary, and I think we need to get over that and to be able to envision the worst, while hoping it won't happen, but recognizing that it can happen. We're no nicer than anyone else in history as a group. And I think that's an important way to stand up for yourself, is to be realistic. Other questions for Richard? Yes, in back.
Hi. I did have a question about, you kind of touched on the lurid fascination with the dark side of the Holocaust studies, which is ample, right? Why do you think it leans that way? Is it moral laziness? Is it kind of a past, like, well, people are this terrible, really, by the numbers? Why do you think that has weighed so heavily on that side instead of these stories that you...
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons. So one is, which was mentioned here, is in the period of time right after the Holocaust, there was a concern among survivors, many of whom at that time had come out of camps, so they had actually not been rescued, or they'd had, it wasn't, that you not distort the record, because again, rescue was so rare, and it was really, most people didn't act like that. So I think, there was which I think there's some validity to it, but then there was sort of in the 60s, people like my friend Abe Foxman, who were child rescuers, there was a movement to try to recognize the rescuers. And actually, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, from its founding, one of its core missions is to actually honor. So there's this whole kind of Jewish thought about gratitude. But there was this concern, and then I think the other part of it is we are, so you don't want to distort the war, and obviously, most people didn't behave this way. And then I think there is the part of us that is, very interested in the evil, which is why the news is always bad news. And so, most of the work that was done after the war were done on why did people, why did the Nazis do this? Why did people collaborate, which is a whole other thing, and then why did so many people stand by? So I think part of it is a reflection on the actual historical record, and part of it is just, what we focus on. I will say, I'm fascinated by a portion in the Talmud where they talk about the first rescuer was the Pharaoh's daughter, and the sort of, in the Talmud they talk about how she had many different names, right? And I'm sorry, Moses had many different names, including the name that his parents gave him. But the name that we know him by, Moses, which is an Egyptian name, Tutmosis, is the name that she gave him. And they say in the Talmud that God refers to Moses by the name that the Pharaoh's daughter gave to him as a show of respect and gratitude towards and sort of honoring this first rescuer. And so it's this fundamental. What's that? Bitya in Chronicles, yes. And so yeah. But this idea of gratitude towards the rescuers is very important, I think, both in terms of showing them, as Jews or just as humanists, that we appreciate what they did and the fact that they, kind of redeem hope in humanity after the Holocaust. And Hannah Shanesh has this beautiful poem about how, they're like the light that comes from stars, right? And even when they're gone, you still see the light. And she said they shine brightest in the dark, when it's the most dark, and they light the way for mankind. I always thought about that because the stories actually, when you actually really look deep into what happened there, that's really the only thing that can give you hope is that these people did this. So I think that is why the balance has been very different. And I think it's important to all the work that's been done on the Holocaust, very important that it's all the bad is covered, but I think this is an area that's just been way too overlooked.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think also particularly after the war, you know, because of the unprecedented scale and cruelty of this event in human history, there was a justifiable fascination with, you know, and as the details emerged, you know, people needed to know about it. But I do think over time there are people who sort of fetishize this in a way that I'm not sure is completely healthy when there are, as you know, you have demonstrated, other things that one could focus on. I think we probably have time for one more question. Yes.
So I'm Olivia Mattis from the Susan Mendes Foundation, so happy to co-sponsor this. So we're having Richard as our guest next week, talking about Sugihara. We have a Sugihara survivor here, Dr. Sylvia Smaller. I don't know if you had a chance to meet her in person yet.
Nope.
So maybe if you're interested in Sugihara, you will tune in and hear their conversation next week.
Excellent. All right. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everybody.